Dear girls, I will write 2 letters at one time tonight, as I want to write to Uncle John too. We were at town today. I just can't tell you how bad things looked. We could not go north of Madison Street into the worst part, as they are working cleaning things away. There are guards on every street. I could see plenty without even going up there, though. We drove out to the fairgrounds. It looked like the pictures of a battleground.
The world in 1917 was itself engaged in a storm, storms of conflict with many ideals struggling to be heard and acknowledged. Russia's Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne as well as his son's claim, marking the end of the Russian Empire and painting a path toward Lenin's idea of a communistic world. With the winds of war stirring across Europe since 1914, the United States stayed out of the conflict until Congress declared war against Germany on April 6th. In May, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, giving the President the power of conscription. The winds of war swept across the Atlantic Ocean, but did not concern many in the prairie lands of the Midwest. They were still thinking about the planting season and providing food for the masses of people that relied on them. Across the prairie, the winds blew the grasses like waves across the sea. The landscape was perfect for cultivating crops for livestock and for humans. Farming was in the blood of the inhabitants of east central Illinois. The land was known for having a variety of weather: ice storms, droughts, torrential rains, blizzards, and occasionally God's finger would descend from the heavens and wreak havoc across the prairie. Weather forecasting was very primitive in the early 1900s. Although the United States Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. recorded weather conditions daily, forecasts were non-existent, except for those who were told how to read the skies from generations of patterns passed down. Many farmers across the region could provide you with a general forecast in the form of rhymes. One particular rhyme describes evidence that the atmosphere is becoming more humid, with the possibility of rain. When the windows won't open, and the salt clogs the shaker, the weather will favor the umbrella maker. Another describes the calm before the storm. No weather is ill, if the wind be still.
Well, see, growing up on a farm, though, in the country many years ago, we had no warning sign. You read the clouds. It says in that what I read that they looked at the sky and they knew what was coming. So they were their own weather forecasters. Everybody knew to pay attention when the clouds got a certain color. So that's, what I grew up learning. And if it's green, you better hurry.
They didn't have the warnings. They had no idea there's a tornado coming their direction. Whereas today, if we heed them, well, we have warnings where we can get to the basement or do whatever we can. And obviously they had either didn't know or didn't worry about it. Maybe they felt like, well, if we're in our home, we're as safe as we can be, and let come what may.
Well, you just take precautions. When you see a bad storm, growing up in the country, we'd be out in the field and we'd see the clouds turning really dark and with a green color to it. You knew you better get to the safety place. So you learn to read the signs and take, action.
I will try to tell you as best I can what we experienced, some of the things we saw, and what we did following the tornado of May 26th. The morning was cloudy, as the weather had been for several days previous. About 11 o'clock, there was a little rain, but by 12 the sun was shining, but there was a peculiar haze all around. I timed myself in going home that day just to see how long it would take me, and I was just 10 minutes in going a little over half a mile. Sister was home as it was Saturday, and she and Mother had a good dinner, and I was so hungry I ate more than I usually do. It seemed we all did. Little did we think that would be the last meal we would eat in that house for over 3 months. But one never knows what is before them. I returned to the office, second floor of the courthouse, where I was during the tornado. My father, mother, and sister remained at home, where they were during the tornado. My sister thought she would bake a cake for Mother as her birthday was on May 30th. Would be the next day after her school closed, and she was afraid she would not have time then. She made a fine chocolate cake and never had better luck. She also made a small one and showed it to Father, who had been almost helpless since his sickness the last of February, and told him we would have that for supper. She put the large cake on a small table in the dining room and the small cake in the safe.
In 1917, my grandparents, Archie and May Block, lived and farmed on Route 16 West, halfway between Mattoon and Gaze. The 1917 tornado made such an impression on my grandfather that he talked about it for the rest of his life, for the next 50 years. On the afternoon of the 26th of May, 1917, the storm blew into Coles County. My grandfather had realized that a storm was coming, so he was working in the barn. But he was a farmer, a weather watcher, and as the tornado appeared a half-mile north of his barn, he and the hired hand stood and watched from the barn door. He described the tornado as a huge storm, sweeping up structures, building materials, vegetation, livestock, and much dirt and dust. He was in his late 30s, but he had never seen such a sight. When he could no longer see the storm, he realized his help would be needed along the destructive path, so he and his hired hand took the wagon, a team of horses, chains, and saws, and went into town along Western Avenue. They and many others worked for days, helping move down trees off of houses and houses off of people. They worked with the hopes of finding survivors and the prospect of finding those who had not survived. These people were my grandfather's friends, people he did business with, people he went to church with, and he was very distressed with all the destruction. My father was born the next year, March 1918. He went through school with a boy whose family had lived just north of my grandparents' house. That boy had been a baby when the tornado destroyed his family's home. He was the only survivor. His whole family had died. Sometimes events are so horrible that people never talk about them. Sometimes horrible events are so memorable that people never want to forget them or to stop talking about them.
There was not one building left standing, and all the trees are broke down, and all the tops are twisted out. Walter Duran had 9 racehorses killed, and his nice home and barn south of the fairgrounds are as flat as they can be. Clifford said Mrs. Bates's home was gone. Ida Witzel said Mrs. Bates had a broken leg below the knee. I just can't tell you how awful it looked. It was a common thing to see people's beds, furnitures, rug, and clothing spread out over the porches and grass to dry, and some even on the fallen limbs next to the pavement. As we passed by Uncle Bird's house, some men were at his home working. We tied up and went in. The roof was gone, the walls were split, and some of them fallen out. The carpets, rugs, and everything was soaked. Uncle said he and Daisy were trying to hold the west kitchen door shut when all at once it was all over before they even had time to think. They have moved in with George Olmsted. The front room was left pretty solid, also the kitchen and the room south of it. It seems like the east side of the house took the worst and was torn up. He thinks he can fix 3 or 4 rooms. He said that this is his home and he wants to stay there. There is a good place to help the needy with a few dollars. The western and high windows are mostly gone, and the windows are broken out of a lot of stores. Parkers are moving out for repairs, and they're moving about a block north. Raul Zimmerman's house is turned around, the roof is gone, and glass out. Anders' one house, east of town, that fine large one has been moved off the foundation, and every window is gone. It had such a nice porch around it. You never know the place now, and Cliff McNutt's house is as flat as it can be. and the barn almost as bad. There were about 70 men from Ashmore who went over today to clear off the streets and work wherever they were needed. Even Everett Horbert went. Jamie and Uncle Robert Larrabee were among them. Jamie worked under Andre Daly. They worked this AM out next to the fairgrounds, and this evening they're working at the sanitarium. Trees and grapevines are gone, and the front windows are broken out of the sanitarium. Aunt Emma was sitting by her front window when the glass began to fall around her. Aunt Alice ran to her and dragged her wheelchair away from the window. There were several funerals in town today. Jamie said he heard there were 24 missing yet. They found a girl last night in the rubbish of the Maples Hotel. She was not hurt but was very weak. Today was the first time Max had ever seen National Guards or Boy Scouts, and he came home and got his leggings and belt that I had gotten for him in Colorado, and his gun, and then he thought he looked like them. I got your letter that you wrote Sunday night, but I can't tell about the girls' folks. I expect they have heard by this time about them. Well, I must quit. With love, Mama.
I'm the product of Harlan Groniger, who was there during the May 26, 1917 tornado. He had finished his freshman year at the University of Illinois Ag School and was standing in the lobby of the Byers Hotel that Saturday afternoon. Knowing my dad, he was probably smoking a cigarette. He was a heavy smoker. He was looking out of the north windows on the south side of Broadway, and he said literally Model T cars were moving down the street with their wheels off the ground. They were just being blown down the street. Of course, those cars were light in weight in those days. And so when the storm passed, he jumped out of the Byers Hotel and ran south, I guess 5 blocks to 1505 Marshall, where my grandmother, his mother Jessie, and his younger sister Florence were living. And he determined that they were safe. So, and he's jumping over down power lines that were snapping and all that, kind of dangerous, I would think. And he ran out to the farm, which is in the northeast edge of town at 5th and Payette, Payette being a block north of DeWitt, which the other gentleman described as being the central path going through on DeWitt. And there was a 2-story farmhouse there that our family owned, and it was completely flattened, blown over, and about 50 yards east of that was a large barn, same demise, flattened, blown over.
Dad was 3 years old. He had an older sister, Madeline, who was 5 years old, and a younger one, Marcella, which they called Sally. She was about 5 months old. And Dad would always tell us of how devastating it was, and what he remembered as a 3-year-old, and he was a very good storyteller, so we never knew how much of this was true. But he would say that the water was deep, and like all of the ditches were full of water, and they were down in the water, and there was straw everywhere, and the straw was an item that they talked about. But we'd say, okay, Dad, and he'd say, well, let me tell you about the cyclone or the tornado, and he'd go on about this. But he said that the neighbor, and I have to do some research to find out through census who this is, but was carrying the 5-year-old and the 3-year-old, which was Madeline and Leonard, through the storm, after the storm went through. And their house was completely taken. The only thing left were the front steps. And they could not find my grandmother, Nellie Bose, and the baby. And, they didn't know what had happened to them. And then they heard the baby crying, and they were down in the rubble in the basement, and the chimney had fallen on the back of Grandma's head, and that's why I guess they couldn't hear her at all. She, was unconscious. But it did later, affect her hearing. But they heard the baby crying is the reason that they found him.
Dad worked on the Nickel Plate Railroad. He was a machinist there. And he ended up, when the tornado hit, we were told that my mother climbed into a boiler, which was on the Railroad Avenue here in Charleston. The exact address I don't know. And when this happened, she got in there with my two older brothers, one who would be about 102 years old now, and then there was my second brother who was about 3 years younger. And with my mother being pregnant, apparently, according to the Charleston paper at that time, my grandmother was in there with them. And so they rode that tornado out with them in that boiler. And then that was about the end of the story, other than my dad used to make up some stories. He said it was truthful that you would see straws driven through telephone and power poles.
My father told me that my great-grandfather Blake was in the search party that found them, and said the only way that they found great-grandmother was that her apron was sticking out from under the debris that covered her. They were found in the gully to the east where the home had stood. The home was on top of them. According to my mother, the tornado came east out of Charleston along the railroad until it crossed the river, turned south between my grandparents' Monroe Ferguson house and the home of my great-grandparents, James Ferguson. They were about a quarter of a mile apart. Tornado continued southward until it struck the home of my great-grandparents, Sweeney. Then it turned back northeasterly and moved out of the area. My Aunt Gladys Ferguson Drum told me that my grandfather, Monroe Ferguson, went out in the woods and found letters, clothing, and household items strung through the woods. They found one letter or envelope that was slipped over the end of a branch. Rex told me that he and his father, John, went over to the Sweeney home site after the storm with a horse and wagon and caught the chickens after dark. He said that a horse and a cow were still tied to the manger where the barn had been, but the barn was gone. Rex also told me that the bodies of William R. and Eliza Sweeney were kept at the John Sweeney home for 3 days before they were taken to an undertaker to prepare for burial. This was due to the tremendous amount of work that they had to do after the tornado.
Well, Old Ned was a horse that my grandfather and his brother and 3 sisters rode to school in Hinesboro, Illinois. They lived out in Boundary Township and either rode this horse or rode in a carriage behind the horse all through their school years. But the famous part of Old Ned is that he was pulling a buggy with a Mr. and Mrs. Warman in the Charleston area at the time of the 1917 tornado. Supposedly, they were trying to escape the tornado and put Old Ned in their barn, and the tornado actually hit the house and hit the barn and destroyed them and killed the owners of Ned. But Ned survived. The barn fell down around him and he sustained slight injuries.
The house was carried 8 feet east, 3 feet north, then the entire east half of the roof gave away and the house came down. And all that roof, sheeting, rafters was carried away. We never found any of it. It may be still going as far as I know. Everything we had was water soaked. 2 of our feather beds, the water went all the way through. 2 we got to and protected with things, so they were wet only on one side. Every blanket, comforter, quilt was wet. Carpet, rugs, covered with glad, plastering, mud, soot, and water. The only thing dry we had was some underclothing we had in trunks. The safe was turned over and all of our dishes were broken, mixed up with what food we had left from dinner. The only thing left we had to eat was Ma's birthday cake, which was unharmed, except as we found out later was covered with fine glass and soot. The only good thing was none of us wanted to eat.
It went through so fast, and then all of a sudden the sun came out like nothing happened. it plays with your mind because it's so quick and so devastating, and then all of a sudden the sun comes out and it's, it's terrible. So no wonder the people that have the real bad ones, are fearful for quite some time, if not the rest of their life.
Uncle Lyman and my dad Harlan, a farmhand that worked for him, and a couple other, and they rebuilt the house on the same foundation, 2-story home, which is where I grew up. And then they turned their efforts and rebuilt the barn. And I believe they completed that work in November of 1917. And then my dad joined the Army, World War I.
It's part of the history and how the people had to deal with all this disaster that came upon them. They had to rebuild their lives, and I don't know how many people had insurance back then. That was another concern. If you didn't have the money to rebuild, it was hard. Some people didn't believe in insurance. My grandfather didn't, and his house burnt down, and he kind of wondered afterwards.
What nature can do to people, the power of nature, was certainly an important part of this story. The fact that Mattoon got back on its feet, and kind of like my grandfather and his fingers, he got back on his job that afternoon, that it is possible to come back after something terrible happens, and it does take a lot of people pulling together, and all those people who went into town to pull the houses off of people. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of teamwork, so to speak, but it's possible to do that, and I think Mattoon did certainly come back after such crushing devastation. I guess that's the only thing to describe it. It was horrible.
The people gay and happy in their cars, their little homes, they little thought so shortly they'd be forced to meet their doom. We saw the storm approaching, the cloud looked deathly black, and through our little city it made a fearful track. We saw the lightning streaming and heard the thunder roar. It was the shortest moment. The story soon was told. We heard the crash of timber, of buildings tumbling down. It would melt the hardest hearted to hear the dreadful sound.
Now we are back into our house. We moved into it the last week of August before it was finished. As you know, with so much destruction, everyone was wanting work done. Some paid as high as $1 an hour for some common labor. We waited and tried to get good, responsible contractors to do the work. We feel our house is stronger than before. We put on new room on the west and made a porch larger. It has cost us over $3,000 and we had no insurance. It has been real hard on us all. We hope that this is the last tornado for Charleston and that you will be spared ever going through anything like this. What impressed me the most was the tremendous power and the miraculous saving of lives. God certainly went through Charleston May 26, 1917, and showed the people His power to protect as well as His power to destroy.